We had a great fight between Alireza Firouzja and Fabiano Caruana in the FIDE Grand Swiss event earlier this year. Fabi had white and he kicked off with pawn to e4, and we went in for this caro kann, which Firouzja loves to play. Fabi goes for the advanced variation, so looking to keep tension on the board, and we had this bishop f5 move and now pawn to h4. So white will squash this bishop if black isn't careful, and that's why pawn to h5 is played. You can play pawn h6 as well. Now we had bishop to d3, so that active piece gets exchanged, and now queen a5 check. It looks slightly strange playing like this, because after white blocks, why are you developing your queen so early? But we'll see that this queen is looking to sit on a6 and trade off with the active white queen. So we had pawn to e6 now from Firouzja, knight to e2. Again, Fabi develops this one to the second rank because he wants to keep the way clear for this f-pawn potentially in future. Now we had knight to e7 developing. This knight would love to sit on this f5 square, which has been secured by the pawn. And here Fabi plays a really interesting idea. So you could castle here, but after something like queen to a6, best is exchanging, the knight recaptures, and white's still a little bit better here, but black has a fairly easy game. The knight's coming to f5, the pawn's coming to c5, there's not too many development problems. So that's why Fabi was looking to shake it up here, and instead he plays the really interesting move, instead of castles, pawn to b4. So it looks a bit strange just throwing a pawn like this, but if black captures, you can go rook to b1 and say queen to a4, then you can take on b7, and this is actually pretty good for white with a very active rook here, as we can see. So Firouzja didn't take, he didn't want to get in for this, and instead he drops the queen back to a6, trying to carry on with that plan of exchanging these pieces. But once again, Fabi seeks to keep tension in the position by playing queen to b3. So we had knight to f5 in response, now knight to f3, adding more protection here and opening up this bishop for development. Knight to d7 developing, and now pawn to a4 from Fabi. So he's trying to blow black off the board on the queen side, and that's why Firouzja has to react here. He plays queen to c4. Now you could take this queen, but after the pawn recaptures and bishop to d2 protecting this one, which is attacked by the bishop, this isn't necessarily so great for white. White still has an advantage, but black will soon bring the knight to b6 and then into d5, and these are very strong centralized knights, so it's not so much for white here. And that's why instead Fabi chooses to leave the queen where it is and instead play bishop to d2 immediately, defending this b4 pawn. Firouzja now takes on b3, Fabi recaptures, and this is already a very interesting position on the board. So there's these double pawns here, but it has opened the c-file, and it's made it very difficult for black to play the standard c5 break, which black is often looking to do in these structures. So that's why Firouzja actually plays pawn to f6 immediately. Another standard break. If he can't break here, then he'll try and undermine these dark squared pawns instead. So Fabi now castles, we have bishop to e7 developing, and now pawn to g3, a tidy move securing the position. King to f7 now, looks good, connects the rooks, and rook f to e1. So there's some pressure coming down this e-file here, and this pawn is sensitive, as we can see. He could have played something like rook to e8 here, just protecting like this. The bishop might drop back soon in this manner. But instead Firouzja plays in a more direct manner here. He immediately takes on e5, and this resolves the issue of the e-file where the rook was sitting, but it does give up this g5 square. Having said that, he mobilises the d-pawn, so you give a bit, you lose a bit. We had rook a to c8 now, coming to that file which will soon open, and knight to f4, opens the rook and improves this knight, and it also has a threat with it. So if Firouzja had played pawn to c5 here, which looks natural, now you're running into knight takes on d5, and you can't recapture, or there's e6 check, and this is just good for white. So that's why instead Firouzja here plays pawn to d4 first, and he's following with c5 soon. Fabi now responds with rook a to c1. He's anticipating the opening of that file, and now pawn to c5. And here Fabi actually jumps in anyway with knight to d5. And again, you don't want to take this as black, or you're running into e6, and this is really good. So Firouzja takes on b4, and now Fabi chops this bishop. We note that that bishop was protecting this pawn, it was keeping an eye on this sensitive g5 square, so that move makes a lot of sense. The knight recaptures, and now Fabi has a choice. Best would have been to play bishop takes on b4, and we could have had a line like this, with the bishop dropping in on d6, and we can see that this is looking really nice for white. Black is a bit pinned down, and this pawn might drop later as well. But instead of this, Fabi went for another line which looks really good, with knight g5 check. The king stepped away, and yes, you're winning this pawn now, but black does get some active pieces in compensation. So Fabi first swaps off the rook so that he can keep an eye on this one with his rook. The rook recaptures, and now we had knight takes on e6. So knight to c6 now, attacking this pawn, and that's why we had pawn to f4 here defending. And now king to f5, a great move by Firouzja. He leaves that g7 pawn on prise, which Fabi now grabs, but he simply drops the king back after it's gone. And he's actually offering Fabi a draw here if Fabi wants it. So if Fabi had repeated here with knight to g7, well then you're just drawing the position. But he doesn't do this, he plays knight to g5. I mean, you're a pawn up, you're pressing here with these pawns, why would you want to take the draw? But now Firouzja gets great counterplay with knight to c5, so this pawn is sensitive, and Fabi's going to need to take care of that. He first plays knight f7, threatening this fork here. That's why we have king to e6, knight to d6 anyway. The rook moves away, and now king to g2, protecting this pawn. And now we had king to d5, so we can see how active Firouzja's pieces are getting, and this king could be marching into the position soon. Rook to b1 now defending that pawn, and knight to e4 here. Just running it back a move, it's actually really hard for white to make progress here, and black could have sat on the position with a move like b6 for example. You can't push these pawns so easily or you're losing pieces. If you try and push this one, then the e5 pawn is gone and your knight is taking it. So it's not so easy. Instead, Firouzja actually played knight into e4 immediately, and he was probably tempted by the fact that after these knights get exchanged, he's now marching the king into the position. So the rook slid across, the king carried on in, the bishop dropped back, king to e2, and now look at this pawn. This is getting really scary for white, but white has counterplay. So pawn to e6 here. And black has some problems of his own he has to be really careful of. Pawn to d3 now, pawn to f5, and knight to d4. So this knight comes menacingly into the position, looking at this pawn, but it does lose the protection of this one now on b4. So Fabi now chops that pawn off. We had pawn to d2, and the bishop is forced to recapture, and the king recaptures. The rook jumps up to c5, it was attacked by the king, and black drops the rook into e8, getting in front of those passed pawns. So we can see that white has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pawns. Black has 3 pawns in the piece in compensation for that. But the big problem for black, not only are these 2 pawns passed and connected, but the king is now a bit stranded. It was a powerful attacking force, but now it's on the other side of the board, when really it wants to be on, say, f6 here. So we had rook to e5 coming behind that passed pawn, king to d3, and now a nice move by Fabi, king to f2. And there's a deepish idea behind this move. Basically, you want to push these pawns, but you can't go f6 or you lose this one. Let's say with rook takes on e6. If you go e7 first, preparing f6, well now knight c6. And this is hitting both rook and pawn and you're in some trouble. Now you can check, and there's a line that goes like this, which the computer finds. The rook comes behind, you step your king away so as not to walk into some skewers here. Now we take, rook takes, and you could have a position like this where white is still better with the extra pawn, but it's not entirely clear. And so that's why instead of going for this, in this position, Fabi plays king to f2 here. So now if we saw a passing move, like say pawn to a6, now you can go e7, because knight c6 in this line, you can go rook e3 check, because it's supported by the king now. So that's why after this move king to f2, we had rook to e7 from Firouzja, now pawn to g4 from Fabi, so he gets these ones rolling. Pawn takes, king to g3, rook to e8, staying in front of the pawn, king takes, and knight to c6 now, attacking the rook. And this is where Fabi shows some really nice calculation now. So he plays king into f4, not minding if that rook's taken, because these pawns are just going to decide the game now. They're too deadly. So instead of this, after king f4, Firouzja tried knight e7. We had pawn to f6, knight to g6 check. The king stepped up. Again, you don't take the rook, it's no good. So Firouzja took here with check, king g5, knight f3 check, king f4, knight d4, trying to take this pawn, but pawn to e7 now, knight to c6, pawn to f7, and it's all over because after the rook takes here, we don't actually queen straight away because now you could have knight takes on e5, and if you pick up the rook, you're running into this check. So it's still a little bit unclear, even though white's better. But there's no need to do this because after rook takes, you can play rook d5 check. And in this position, Firouzja actually resigned because this one's going through and it's a much better variation. So a fantastic fight between these players and lovely opening preparation from Fabi. If you enjoyed this game, then click here to subscribe, and see another amazing Firouzja game, click here. Thanks very much for watching and see you soon.